Evolution is one of those things that our culture has produced. It is the dominant way that biologists and geologists, paleontologists, physicists, cosmologists think about the world. And so we need to have a good handle of what that is. Maybe not because our jobs rely on it, but just out of sheer cultural awareness. So one of the things that the specials and things like that don't do is it doesn't present evolution in a single coherent fashion most of the time. Very few Discovery Channel specials, here are all the evidences for evolution, because apparently people don't watch those. So instead what you should do is grab a high school biology textbook or even a college biology textbook. Get a used one from someplace like thriftbooks.com or the other myriad of used books out there, and you're going to be able to find one pretty easy. Any introductory biology book is going to have at least one solid chapter dealing with the evidences for evolution. And they'll talk about cosmic evolution maybe a little bit, but mostly in biology, they're going to be focusing on the major biological evolution arguments, the fossil record, the similarities that different organisms have with each other, what's called homology, like the fact that my hand is made up of certain bones and so is the paw of a dog and the hand of a whale. They're going to be talking about genetic arguments and evidences, things from natural selection, et cetera. There'll be like 5 or 6 major points of argument about evolution. Grab one of those books. It might even be at the local library. Those still exist. Right? We can go to those and grab one and go through it, section by section with your kids, not the whole textbook, but that unit, and at whatever level is appropriate, and talk about them. What are the arguments that they're presenting? And then if you want something that is say skeptical of that or a creationist perspective on it, you can hop on any of a good number of websites that will provide you with free web articles that are going to talk about those. So in the United States, the main 3 creation organizations are Answers in Genesis, the Institute for Creation Research, ICR, and Creation Ministries International, CMI. You go to any one of those and you type in any one of the evidences that you were looking at, you're going to find a boatload of stuff. You can obviously get books that will talk about them as well. But, I find that one of the ways that I always felt I could be the best creationist I could be is that if I became the best evolutionist I could be. That if I was going to be a paleontologist and I was going to convince other paleontologists that I wasn't a walking moron, that I actually knew a little bit about what I was talking about, I had to be able to impress them with my knowledge and understanding of evolution, not only the basic evidences, but getting down in the weeds of how does it work and what about this organism or what about this particular argument or what about these several different ways that evolution might work. And there's arguments about which one does the trick. Tried to show that I was as aware or more aware than most of my colleagues on that. Evolution is important to the sciences, but it's not the most important thing to all the sciences. If you're in physics or you're in chemistry, evolution doesn't matter. It just doesn't. Whether or not this chemical reacts with this chemical, Darwin's got nothing to say on that, and neither do modern evolutionists. And that's fine. You get into engineering and other aspects like that. Those are areas that don't talk about these topics very much. But it doesn't mean that they're still not something that we need to know. So don't be afraid to watch some of those specials and grab some of those books. There are well-known books like What Evolution Is by Jerry Coyne. Now, he's an aggressive writer, and you might not want a whole book on his arguments as to why evolution is the answer to everything. But if you wanted a book, by a well-known, well-thought evolutionist about why he thinks evolution is true, Coyne's one of those guys that you should probably read. And if you're in biology and you're a Christian, you should probably read it just so that you know, because this is maybe the way that your professor thinks. And you want to be able to relate to your professor. You want to be able to talk with them meaningfully. Get a leg up, and they'll be impressed, at your wisdom and knowledge if you dedicate extra time to it. So, for the parents out there, those are some places that you can go to get the information of what an evolutionist thinks about. Textbooks are the great place to start. They really are. Have your kids read them. Have your kids write a little essay. And it might seem like parroting it back, but make sure that they know. And don't be afraid to do that sort of thing. That's all right. And so when they're in college, they've got a little bit of a leg up. This is going to be the first time that they've seen an argument for evolution. In a sense, it's kind of like, it's like getting a flu shot before flu season shows up. ready for the argument. I know what it's like.
So when it comes to the theory of evolution, or the dogma of evolution, whatever you want to call it, the paradigm of evolution, I often wonder if there are any particular bottlenecks of it, or say a thread where it's hanging by a thread here, and if that thread just gets pulled, the whole thing falls apart. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, in the spirit of intellectual humility and integrity here, Christianity does that. The Bible explicitly says if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, pull that thread and the whole thing falls apart, right?
Yeah.
And our preaching is in vain. Everything is worthless, and we might as well start over and pack up. We're nuts. We're crazy if Jesus is not risen from the dead. Does evolution have some of those little bottleneck points, some of those little pins, some of those little threads that it may have a great ideas, many of which have some scientific merit, but then they hang on this one little idea, and if that didn't happen, well, that kind of messes the whole thing up. Perhaps just some quick questions, like if somebody says, I don't believe in creation, there's just too much science, I'm an evolutionist. Sure. Like, what's maybe a couple questions you could ask them to say, just to get them thinking critically about evolution?
That's a good question. One thing to avoid in our thinking is that there's a magic bullet. Yeah. Whereas I think you're right. Christianity hangs entirely on whether or not Jesus Christ died on the cross, was buried and dead, and was raised again on the third day. If that doesn't happen, then I convert to Judaism. That's it, because Christianity is not the fulfillment of the scriptures. Evolution is a very multifaceted sort of situation. Christianity is, in one sense, much more simple. Jesus Christ is part of the Godhead, and he died for your sins, and he rose again as proof of that deity. Evolution is coming at it at the scientific evidence from a lot of different angles, and some of them are stronger than others. So there are definitely points of weakness, as there are in any large theory that's trying to explain a lot of stuff. But there are definitely threads you can pull on and ask somebody, have you considered this, as a problem for evolution? Again, not as a defeater, not as like, therefore I win, drop the mic, but rather, are you willing to consider some different options? The first thing that I would consider, and it's a higher level philosophical question, but is, why must science exclude the possibility of miraculous activity? That's what we call philosophical naturalism. And when it's applied to science, we often call it methodological naturalism. That's a mouthful, but it means our methodology in science is to exclude supernatural explanations. And while that might seem like a good rule of thumb, what it does is very artificially narrow the playing field to only a few certain classes of explanation. And if methodological naturalism is the only way we can approach science, then something like evolution has to be true. Because if we have to exclude from the very beginning the possibility that God could interact with the world, change things, create things, make things, raise people from the dead, then Christianity is false by definition. Evolution is true by definition, of a bunch of other things. And so I think that's just putting shackles on us when we don't need it. If we say, well, is there anything philosophically that says, no, we can't have miracles? No, there isn't. So let's open up that playing field just a little bit and see where it gets us. Because you could still have evolution. Christianity could still be wrong if methodological naturalism is abandoned. If we allow all the options on the table, it could still be that Christianity is not correct. I don't think that's going to happen. But I like the idea of playing on a level field rather than one that is already pitched and determined what the answer is going to be. But if we get into the science, and most people aren't going to be talking that philosophical level, but it is something to ask people and say, have you considered that miracles, that excluding miracles is a philosophical and not a scientific question? There's nothing in the rules of science that say we can't have miracles. That's a philosophy that drives how science operates. Once we get into the science questions themselves, we're human beings. So, thinking of two things that might deal with us and the question of human evolution. Humans are supposed to have split away from the group that leads to chimpanzees. about 6 million years ago. So 6 million years ago, we're supposed to be the same species, but this population starts doing this thing and this population starts doing different. And this one goes towards Homo sapiens. This one goes towards modern chimps. And along the way, there's other fossils and stuff. But 6 million years ago is kind of that split point. We know the genome of humans and we know the genome of chimps. Those have both been sequenced, since the mid 2000s and late 2000s. And one of the things that we've discovered is that the number of genetic differences between chimpanzees and humans cannot be accounted for in a mere 6 million years.
Okay.
But to hear merely 6 million years, like, that's a long time. Yes, it is. But even granting 6 million years worth of evolutionary development, it cannot explain how different human beings and chimpanzees are. It's known in the literature as the waiting time problem, because it seems like there's more time that we need to generate humans and chimpanzees, but the fossil record constrains us to a certain period of time. You go, that's a problem, right? Because before that, you have the ancestors of a lot more things than just chimps and humans, but you get to this point, it's supposed to be just chimps and humans, and even with 6 million years, it can't explain all the differences that we have. That is sobering. And it's something that has got a lot of evolutionists scratching their heads and they're not sure what to do, but because they think that the other evidences for evolution are all so strong, this is one of those threads that they're just like, well, we'll just let that kind of dangle there. Don't pull on it too hard, for heaven's sake. But that's irritating. This is a problem. And another thing that's a problem with thinking about us as human beings and our own evidence, again, genetic in this case, is that every time we have kids, those kids are obviously different from us. That we don't make clones as much as one of my boys is a lot like me. He's not my actual clone. And every time we have a generation, there are a number of mutations that happen in that next generation that were not found in the parents. So I got certain mutations that my parents don't have, and my kids have some that I don't have. These accumulate over time. These aren't bad mutations. This isn't like Swamp Thing. This isn't, some mutant from a bad sci-fi movie in the 50s. Bad mutations manifest themselves, or I should say, substantial mutations manifest themselves almost always very badly. And they don't get passed on to the next generation because if it's a sufficiently large mutation, it impacts whether or not that child develops or can have children into the future. So really substantial mutations are rare to be preserved because the person usually doesn't even make it out of the womb. So these are like little tiny mistakes, tiny little ones that don't matter much, but over time they end up becoming baggage for us. My colleague, geneticist John Sanford, refers to this as genetic entropy. Entropy is the idea in physics that things have a tendency towards disorder. You start up with a really clean room, and without doing anything, it at least accumulates a bunch of dust, right? And that's because the dust settles. That's entropy. So every generation, we accumulate more junk. And looking at the amount of junk that we have in our genome, it doesn't look like we've been around for 6 million years. We don't have this long history. We don't even have a history that goes back a couple 100,000 years for our own particular species. Rather, it seems like our genome is much more fresh than that. It hasn't gone through this many generations. So we know how frequent our mutations are. We know how long we're supposed to have been around for evolution. And we couldn't have been around this long because all these mutations would have been death by 1,000 cuts. Our species would cease to exist within that span, and yet we're here. So we have more differences with the chips than even 6 million years can account for. Mm-hmm. And we have enough genetic baggage that we couldn't have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. It looks more like separate creation. Little threads that people know they're there. They're irritating me. I've got all these other evidences that I think are strong, but these things are really bothersome. And for a creationist like myself, I look at it like those might be, it's not just a thread. I think there's a ball of yarn here. If I start pulling this, it actually keeps on going because it's not just humans that have this genetic baggage problem. It's every species on Earth. Every species accumulates slow errors and can't be as old as we think that they are. So those are some things, in my own field of geology, there's things that pop up from time to time. You mentioned the Great Unconformity. So an unconformity in rocks, if we think about a stack of rocks, like pancakes, if you had a stack of pancakes that was 5 high, and then one of your kids came by and they ate the 2 pancakes, they left a few crumbs behind, and then they stacked on a couch cushion to try and fool you, right? You know, you're like,
Yeah.
something's wrong here. You've got evidence that there was something there before. Those crumbs are telling you there was something on top of that other pancake, and then you got this other weird rock on top. It's kind of like that in the rock record. We have got across all of North America, the entire continent. Sooner or later, you get down to kind of granite and some other igneous and metamorphic rocks. We call these basement rocks. For the Minecraft kids who are watching, this is bedrock.
Yeah.
It's not really bedrock, but yeah, we'll call it bedrock. It's like this is the stuff that makes up the continent. And then there's this erosion scar over top of it. And on top of that erosion scar is generally a bunch of sedimentary rocks, sandstones, limestone, things that might have fossils in them. And in between is missing time. Just like the time that it took your kid to go in there and eat those pancakes and then go and get the pillow and put it on and try and fool you that your pancakes are all there. 2-year-olds are not that bright. There is evidence of a gap in time between the crystal igneous rocks and these sedimentary rocks. A gap of 1 billion years of time. Now, the Earth is supposed to be about 4.5 billion years old. So, you know, if you think about that, and I'm like, oh, I'm 45, that would be like me losing my 30s. Like, they just went away. They weren't around. I was around for my zeros and my 10s and my 20s. The 30s are gone. I know I lived them, but I show up again and I'm 40. It doesn't work. So for my evolutionary colleagues, they're trying to think, well, how do we explain 1 billion years of missing rocks? How was there no deposition? How was there nothing else? How did this stuff get completely scraped clean and started with rocks that generally start having fossils in them? And it's a point of research for a few of them that are finally coming around. And this is a problem that's been known for almost 150 years. It's been around for a long time. It's been one of those threads. Because every once in a while somebody will tug on it and they're like, I'm not getting anywhere with this. It's more thread. I don't know, whatever.
So just so I'm clear, they claim the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and there's 1 billion of those years missing in the rock layers. And this isn't some anomaly in one little place. This is widespread across the North American continent.
Yeah.
And they've known for 150 years that one of the 4 billion years is not there in the record.
In most places on Earth, yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So there are places where they've got rocks that they think fit in there, but there still is this kind of big erosion gap and then rocks with fossils on top of them. So John Wesley Powell was a Northern officer during the Civil War, and later he decided to send a team. He led the team. He only had one arm too, which was kind of wild. And he wanted to try and chart his way through the West on river. And so he went down the Colorado River, went through Grand Canyon, was the first white person anyway, to go through Grand Canyon and live. Of his team, 6 people didn't. So it was a pretty grim situation. But he was the one who actually gave it this name, this Great Unconformity. So an unconformity is a spot in the rocks where there's missing time. And he realized when he first saw it that this was not just any unconformity. This thing was amazing. It was just granite, sedimentary rock, and there seemed to be a lot of missing time. Now, we could go visit the Great Unconformity here in Virginia. If we took Interstate 66 or 64 over into the Shenandoah Valley, by the time we crested through the hills, we would go through the same gap. And I could stop at an outcrop and we could look at it and like, yeah, here's the basement rock and here's the sedimentary rock on top of it. This one has got little worm traces and fossils. This is the Great Unconformity. Now, Powell's seeing this in Arizona and we're seeing it in Virginia. And I could take it to you in Pennsylvania and upstate New York, to the Dakotas, to Colorado, to Montana. It's called the Great Unconformity by Powell, but we've recognized it as actually something we can trace from one end of the continent to the other. From a young Earth creationist standpoint, this actually makes a lot of sense if the Great Unconformity represents the beginning of Noah's flood, where we had the world that existed, and as Noah's flood began to destroy the world, it planed off the previous land surfaces. and then began to deposit and bury sediments that are going to have animals that were alive until the flood came, and as the Bible says, took them all away and buried them in the rock layers. So I remember visiting a section of the Great Unconformity as a graduate student in South Dakota, and we went up and we took a look at it, and I was walking back with the other grad students, and they asked me, well, Marcus, what do you do with this? And I started to describe that. And one of the things that had impressed us on our field trip was the evidence for all of like this kind of chaotic activity. There's these giant boulders and broken fragments of rock above the unconformity before you start getting into, we think of sandstone, of like this really nice sandstone. This is like huge boulders that obviously were ripped and torn and deposited. I'm like, this looks like massively catastrophic activity, followed by the waters eventually start to kind of settle down a little bit and they start depositing this other stuff. And a couple of those grad students are walking with me. They're not young earth creationists, but they're like, I can see how that makes sense. So, and that's a great example of being in the world. You can only have a conversation like that if you are in the world. You're not shut up in a monastery somewhere, but you're actually out there with people. And it doesn't mean everybody's got to be a paleontologist or everybody has to be an evolutionary biologist. But what it does mean is that, if you're a plumber and you're talking to one of your colleagues and you have the chance to talk about something that the Bible makes good sense of, yeah, you can do that. Yeah. I got to talk to paleontologists about that, and other people do. So thinking about our parents, right, and how we raise our kids, we need to be able to raise them to live in the world, to be in it but not of it. That might mean that we take some dedicated time and focused time of training them to make sure that they're solid. But the release also has to happen of that. So, whether we're looking at that as I'm training up my child through homeschooling, or I'm training up my child because on Saturdays every day, my kid's going to public school, on Saturday, we spend some time, we go out together on a hike, and we're going to talk and we're going to make sure that life is done with Christ at the center. That we have our meals together at night, no matter what we do, that is part of our, that is kind of how we breathe spiritually. We do these things together with Christ in our midst. If we do that, we can raise robust children for the next generation. And why do we need children that are robust for the next generation? Because the next generation needs to hear the gospel. Yeah. And it's not just so that we can have a comfortable life and our kids can be good kids. We have got to catechize our kids. We've got to engage in catechism. And in Protestant, a lot of evangelical Protestant circles, we don't think of that term a lot. It's an old one. It's used by other denominations or what have you. But a robust understanding of Christian theology means we have to do more work. The world catechizes our kids all the time. Our churches have an hour or 2 or 3 a week. That's not enough. So it's on us as parents to bring the message from the church back into our homes, to do as the Israelites were commanded, to have the words of the Lord on our hands and on our hearts and on our doorposts and on our heads, right? Symbolically, it means that the Bible is with us everywhere that we go, and that the Spirit of the Lord is with us and we dwell upon it.
Yeah. So on that note, speaking of the gospel, and we'll close with this question. You hear the phrase "follow the science" all the time. It's kind of a buzz phrase in the news media and during COVID times and all these things. Everybody wants to claim that they are the ones following the science. Well, as a scientist, this must make you happy. That people want to follow science. Good. Yeah. My question is, can people follow the science all the way to Jesus? Can people follow the science and end up at the gospel?
They can, and they also cannot. Kind of a rabbinical approach here. And I was like, let's see what happens. So you do a proverb on this. If your heart is open and the Spirit is calling you, then God can use anything to draw himself, anything that is good to draw people to him. And if you start down and say to yourself, I don't buy the whole resurrection thing. And somebody hands you a book about the evidence for the resurrection, and it's science heavy. It's about, what happens to the human body during a Roman crucifixion. It's about, what happened with the testimony of the people and all this sort of stuff. You could follow that and you would find Jesus at the end. You could also follow that and go, yeah, but I'm convinced there's another answer out there that I don't know, and so I'll ignore it, right? Romans 1, Paul reminds us that all of creation, every bit of it, because it is made by God, speaks to who he is, and that we all know that God is immensely powerful, beyond nature, and yet the second half of Romans chapter 1 details how people avoid this reality anyway and make for themselves images of animals, right? We deify things because we want to avoid God. So the heart of man is sinful. It just is. We are all fallen. So can you follow the science to God? Yes, with the prompting of the Holy Spirit. Just like you could follow a gospel presentation at a church to Jesus with the Holy Spirit leading. But you could also listen to that same sermon with a hard heart and you'll never hear it, despite the fact that it boldly proclaims the gospel and is accurate and true. So we don't, all of us like to have science on our side because science is culturally important in America and in the West and lots of other places, because science is equated in many ways with truth. And we all want truth on our sides. Before we had modern science, everybody wanted Aristotle and Plato on their side. And so, the medieval church looked at them as proto-Christians and read them as proto-Christians, even though they weren't proto-Christians. It's just, that was a mistake. You shouldn't have read it that way. But everybody wanted Aristotle and Plato and Socrates on their side. Now we all want science on our side. Follow the science. Follow the science and recognize that science is a human endeavor like anything else. And so it's going to be prone to occasional error, because humans are prone to occasional error. It's rooted, our ideas of peer review are rooted in good, I think, ultimately theistic concepts. Peer review means that you have an inherent recognition of the fallenness of man. Most of my colleagues in evolution don't look at it that way. Peer review is just it's a good error check. Well, yeah. Why? Well, people make mistakes. Why? Well, because, there were natural beings, but how come we're so, sinful ultimately? We have a tendency to do things that are quick and easy and careless, or sometimes for our own vainglory or things like that. Science, when it's done well, can lead us to great discoveries and can lead us towards truth with a lowercase t. Jesus is truth with a capital T. And so those lowercase t's, we want to see them migrating towards the big T. But they by themselves can't get there. They can only be part of how we are led that way. And if the Spirit is using them, then let's all celebrate. Paul says he'll be all things to all people, right? He'd work for his hire, he'd do this, he'd speak like a Greek, he'd speak like a Hebrew all the time because he was carrying the big T. And he'd use the little t's to help draw people there. So in our society, follow the science is a term that I don't like because it implies that there is a single source of science that has a big T or even a bunch of little t's. But science is a human endeavor. It's done by people, and most of my colleagues are trying to do really good work. My evolutionary colleagues do great work. I read their stuff. It's really well done. Sometimes it's not well done, and you're like, that wasn't very good. And sometimes they'll read my stuff. Come on, that was could have done better. So I think it's hard for us because we're not all experts. I'm not a biomedical expert, so I have to rely on my colleagues in the biomedical sciences to do their best, and we hope that they do.